Tapley here for your next lesson of Year 10 History. This lesson we're looking at one of the first, major events in the Aboriginal Rights and Freedoms movement, which was the 1938 Day of Mourning. Success criteria is to outline the cause and effect of early activism in the Indigenous Australian Civil Rights Movement as we look into this event. Any early activism and protests by Aboriginal Australians was overwhelmed by a system of laws and government that neither recognized Indigenous traditions or their ownership of the land. It's very hard to protest for change when you're not recognized as people, because they won't listen to you, they won't help you, they won't support you, they won't enable you to protest, to create change. However, it didn't stop them. In the 1920s, we saw the formation of formal organized protest groups. In 1924, the AAPA, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, was formed. I always get the AAPA confused with, where is it? The APBs. So don't do that. So APB, the Australian Aboriginal Protection Board, that was the government one that was mean to Aboriginals. The AAPA were the good guys. The main focus of this group was the right for Aboriginal self-determination. So they wanted to create their own laws that affected them. They wanted to be responsible for their culture, for their actions. They wanted to be human, basically. Not asking for much, are they? They also wanted land ownership to be acknowledged. They were the rightful owners of the land. They wanted the ability to own land. They wanted to be considered citizens, Australian citizens. And they also wanted an end to children being forcibly removed from Aboriginal families, so the stolen generation. We'll talk about that more next week. The AAPA, however, were forced to disband. They were destroyed in 1927, only after 3 years, after targeted campaigns against them by the government. So the government ran all these ads. They did everything they could, basically, to stop the AAPA from existing, so that only the government was focusing on Aboriginal people. But didn't stop them. Aboriginal civil rights protests continued, despite the efforts of the government and these APBs to dismantle the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association. They were actually reformed later on under a new name, which was also a confusing acronym, but I'll get into that later. And these protests continued until 1938, when we saw the first, major event, where Australia prepared to celebrate 150 years of British settlement. However, Indigenous Australians had another plan for this day. They were going to use this day as an opportunity to send a message. The Day of Mourning protests were the first national Aboriginal civil rights gathering and arguably the beginning of contemporary Indigenous political activism. So this was the first time when protesters, civil rights activists from around the country gathered in one place to talk about Aboriginal civil rights. Before this, it was very much localized to each state that you were in. So you had Victorian groups, you had Western Australian groups. This was the first event where everyone came from around the country to one place to say, we want our rights. The political leaders at this meeting distributed a manifesto, so basically a declaration of ideals saying, we demand this, we demand citizen rights, and we demand recognition as the original inhabitants of the land. So very clearly stating, here's who we are, here's what we're about, and here's what we want. This is a nice little quote here that I thought I'd add to the slide from Jack Patton, who is the president of the APA. Remember that acronym I said? So he formed the original Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, the AAPA. That's him right there, actually. Hello. They were disbanded, but they formed together again, 1938. So he gave a quote on January 26, 1938, the Day of Mourning, and he talked about, how people in Australia view that day differently. So January 26th, of course, is Australia Day, but the Indigenous Australians have a very different relationship with that day. So I'll just read the quote. This festival of 150 years of so-called progress in Australia commemorates or celebrates 150 years of misery and degradation imposed on the original native inhabitants by white invaders of this country. So he's talking about how the rest of Australia is celebrating 150 years of being Australian, but to Indigenous Australians, it's 150 years of having their asses kicked. We do not wish to be left behind in Australia's march to progress. We ask for full citizen rights and the right to a full Australian education for our children. White people do not realise the terrible conditions of slavery under which our people live in the outback districts. Do white Australians realise that Mr. Tapley doesn't know how to spell Australian? That there is an actual slavery in this fair progressive nation. So I mentioned before that Aboriginals did not have minimum wage requirements, so they could effectively be made into slaves. They could be working under slave conditions. This is why this conference is being held, this gathering of Aboriginal protesters from around the country, to discuss ways and means of arousing the conscience of white Australians. So they're basically saying, you all have the power to help us, but you're not doing anything. So we're meeting together, we're standing up, we're shouting at you because we want you to listen. You guys have the power to help us, but until now, you have refused to do so. So they're trying to wake up white Australians, try to speak to their conscience, to their emotions, to their guilt. So, I'm not going to read through each of these, but these were the demands, the 10 statements, 10 points outlined by the Aboriginal activists, civil rights leaders at the Day of Mourning. Right, what we're doing this lesson is reading through a cheeky news article off SBS about the Day of Mourning to answer 3 questions below. So here's the article. Link should take you there. That link down the bottom there will help you with question 3. It's just a video about Aboriginal Australians and their relationship with Australia Day. So the questions that you need to answer after reading this article here. Question 1. Describe the events and the actions held on the Day of Mourning in 1938. So what happened at this gathering of Indigenous activists or protesters? Question 2. Explain the significance of these events in relation to Aboriginal Australians. So why was this such a big deal? Why was it important? What did they do that was significant? Question 3, and this is where that video will help you if you've got really no idea what the answer is. January 26 is currently celebrated as Australia Day. Do you believe this date should be changed? Why or why not? So no wrong answer there. I just want you to explain yourself. The only wrong answer is someone who doesn't say why or why not. So consider what Australia Day means to you, what it might have meant to immigrants from our last area of study, and what it might mean to Aboriginal people. Do you think that we should be celebrating on January 26? Or do you think that we should be celebrating something else? Anyway, that's what you're doing this lesson, guys. Any questions or concerns, of course, let me know. Otherwise, best of luck. Hope you're well. I'm going to pick up whatever I dropped on the floor. And cheers.